Hello and welcome to the Friday, January 23rd, 2026 edition of the SANS Internet Storm Center's Stormcast. My name is Johannes Ulrich and today I'm recording from Jacksonville, Florida. And this episode is brought to you by the SANS.edu Graduate Certificate Program in Industrial Control System Security. And I mentioned yesterday, but we are currently looking for people to fill in our SOC survey. So if you haven't gotten around to it yet, a link to it can be found on the Internet Storm Center's homepage. Well, Xavier today looked at a new tool, Bandit. Bandit is a tool that allows you to static code analysis of Python scripts. Xavier writes a lot of Python and lately also a lot of Python with AI. And there's, of course, a lot of issues that people run into when they are using AI for coding. And in this particular case, it's a script that Xavier wrote. It's about 1,000 or so lines long, so a pretty good size for a Python script. And he looked at Bandit to give him an idea whether or not the script is reasonably secure. Well, it turned out it was actually reasonably secure. It had some minor issues, but then, of course, all depends, as Xavier points out, how the particular script is used, whether or not these issues matter. A lot of the static code analysis is sometimes a little bit mechanical in that sense. When it comes to using AI tools, like to vibe coding, as it's often referred to, one of the important things, first of all, is that you design your prompt correctly. And Xavier gives you some hints there in how to do that and what to look for here. And in my personal experience, it also helps a lot if you actually know how to code and use AI sort of more as an assistant versus having it code all of the code by itself. That way, sort of do a little bit of review anyway as you're checking what the AI tool created for you. And that also usually helps with a lot of logic flow issues and such, and some of the less mechanical vulnerabilities that a tool like this may not find. And then we have a quick update about the recent attacks against FortiGate devices. I mentioned that yesterday that the old patch that was released in December for the single sign-on vulnerability apparently wasn't quite good enough and is still being exploited. Arctic Wolf now did summarize its observations in that matter, and what they found is that, yes, this is definitely a problem, and attackers are using this particular vulnerability to exfiltrate the configurations of devices. So if you are affected, you must reset your credentials they're using to access the device. And yes, then again, the workaround that was published back in December still applies and is still something that you probably must deploy. Haven't seen anything yet from Fortinet. I just looked before starting to record this podcast, but take a look and see if by the time you're listening to this, there is something from Fortinet. A little bit late in that sense, because this is now going on for at least 2 days, in the sense that it has become public, and the attacks apparently have sort of never stopped really since December when they were originally spotted. Well, and then we have an interesting denial of service vulnerability in the ISC BIND name server. This vulnerability is something that I initially didn't really plan to cover because it's just a denial of service vulnerability, but there's an interesting spin to it, which sort of caught my attention, and that's the record types being affected here. There are two records types. One is the HHIT record, and then we have the DRIB record or BRID record. Record types you probably haven't really heard about unless you're dealing with drones. So these record types are part of the DRIP, the drone ID system. If you're somewhat familiar with drone, you may know that some drones are broadcasting or beaconing an ID value. And this DNS extension allows you to essentially use DNS to then look up additional information based on this ID. And these IDs are, conveniently 128 bits, which kind of makes them IPv6 addresses, and there's even an IPv6 prefix set aside for these IDs. The vulnerability is actually relatively straightforward to exploit. All you need is one of those BRID or HHIT records with a length of 3 bytes. They're usually longer, and that will cause the name server to outright crash. So exploitation is pretty straightforward. And even if you don't specifically support these records, well, the name server supports them. So all an attacker needs to do is somehow trick your name server into looking up one of those record types. And then we got an almost funny vulnerability here, SmarterTools SmarterMail. Well, they may be smart, but they're not secure. And Watchtower wrote up a recently patched vulnerability in SmarterMail that affects their password reset API. The vulnerability almost looks like a backdoor. If you are an administrator and if you are resetting an administrator's password, you do not need to provide the old password to the API. So completely without authentication, you may change the administrator's password. Interestingly, if you're a normal user, then the old password is required in order to reset the password via the API. So very weird authentication vulnerability here that then leads to anybody being able to reset the administrator's password without any authentication. Well, and that's it for today. So thanks again for listening. Thanks for liking. Thanks for subscribing to this podcast, and talk to you again on Monday. Bye.